I want to really thank Dr. Ledbetter for taking time to be with us. It's around 7:30 over there, and very soon he'll be going to church to preach. So he's got 1 hour with us. Dr. Ledbetter, this group is the group that I told you about. We is the Walk Through the Bible group, and the intention is not to have a complete understanding of the Bible, but to have a helicopter view of the Bible. And it's one step towards digging deep into various aspects of it, is to be able to, how can we put the whole storyline together? So we arranged the reading plan in chronological order. So after going through the book of Genesis, we then went through the book of Job, which, as you know, is quite one of the oldest books according to what I've read about. So we now have gone through Job, and we are now in the book of Exodus. And while we were going through Job, we encounter a few things. In fact, there are some of us that actually feel that there is a lot of unfair things there. I mean, Job, poor Job, why should he be the specimen for this type of experiment, if you like, you know? And so does it mean that we can just find ourselves in such a mess, you know, as believers? God will just hand it over to Satan like that? So these are some of the sentiments which genuinely people are asking these questions. But then we also will, so like what I would like to do is to give you the first 30 minutes to give us an overview on the book of Job. And then we will now go into 2 or 3 specific questions, which we will then want you to dwell on. I've sent them via email. I'm sure you must have seen them, but I would like to repeat them for the purpose of the recording. So I will hand it over to you now to just give us an overview on the book of Job.
Amen. I'd first like to say thank you, Dr. Samuel John Akai, for this. It's always a privilege and a pleasure and an honor to be with you and to be with your group of students and all that you're doing there, and for its consequences, not only there in Africa, but beyond. And so we really appreciate your studiousness and everything you've done, your spirit and your intellect, everything. When you're looking at the book of Job, you're looking at 42 chapters. And of course, like you said, you're doing it in chronological order. Job is considered one of the ancient, if not the most ancient book in the Bible. And that's for several reasons. I'll just enumerate a few. One reason is that Job lived a long time. We don't know exactly how old he was before his tragedy, but we know he was a seasoned man because everybody looked at him as an elder. And they appreciated him, and they listened to everything he said, especially when he's recounting his past in chapter 29 and 30. And then you know that in chapter 42, after God returned his calamity and caused him to prosper, he lived an additional 140 years. So he lived a long time. I would say he lived at least 200 years, if not more. And so people that lived that long usually lived in the early days of Genesis, perhaps in the antediluvian age before the flood, where they lived hundreds and hundreds of years, or shortly after the flood, in which case they lived less, but they still lived longer than people do today. So that's one reason he's considered ancient. Another reason he's considered ancient is because of his friends and the names. You know, you look at the book of Uz, the place where he came from. You look at his friends, Eliphaz the Temanite. You know, Eliphaz is a very interesting name. And the Temanite comes from Teman, which was the capital of Esau, who was Jacob's twin brother back in Genesis chapter 36. If you look at the genealogy, you'll see the history of Esau. And Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite, very ancient names. Another reason scholars believe that Job is ancient is because he doesn't directly, or his friends directly, refer to the law of Moses. And even though they say things that are very much part of what the law does say, especially philosophically, they don't make reference directly to Moses' law. So some scholars believe that this is another indication that they lived before Moses or pre-law, in which case they would have lived before Exodus as well. So you're well within reason to put Job second to Genesis, because he probably lived in that age. Now, when you're looking at the book of Job, it's a very interesting book because God does never directly say why he allowed these things to come upon Job. He never directly answers the question, but there's so much information in there to summarize what God is doing to a great degree when he's allowing Job to suffer. Job is not suffering because he did something wrong. Job is suffering because he's highlighted as being the one who is good, which kind of seems counterintuitive. We are taught to believe that bad people deserve suffering and good people deserve bliss and happiness. But in Job's case, God is the one who confronted Satan when he said, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on all the earth, one that fears God and escheweth or hates or shuns evil?" And so God is boasting on Job's character as impeccable, that Job's character is above reproach. And so that's how you see the beginning of Job. You see that it's set up in a very simplistic story. Job is a very wealthy man. He has children that are wonderful. They all get along with each other, 10 of them, 7 boys and 3 girls. He has a bunch of sheep, a bunch of donkeys. He has a bunch of camels. He has a tremendous amount of servants. So he's the greatest man of all the men of the East. He's the richest man, but he's also blessed. But there are 2 indicators that demonstrate who Job's character is. And you've probably already gone through this, but for the sake of your students, one of them is in chapter 1 of Job, early on, when God says, Job feared God and hated evil. That shows his character. He's unlike any man in the earth because he really does fear God and he really does shun evil. So it deals with his character more, and that's going to show why everything else is less important to him. And then in verse 5 of chapter 1, where Job would get up early in the morning after his children would meet together, and he would sanctify them with offerings and sacrifices, just in the event one of them may have sinned in their hearts towards God. So Job was doing something extremely sophisticated. Job was concerned with what may be going on inside the heart that you can't see on the outside, whereas the world tends to look on the outside and then determine that the outside is indicative of the inside. Job is very careful not to make that error. He is doing what Jesus taught many, many centuries later, and that is cleanse first the inside of the cup and the platter, and the outside shall be clean also. So he was always concerned with the inward motives, not sinning in your heart before God, covering his children. And so that shows the tremendous degree of his character to be pure inside, not what you can show outside, but how you are inside. So those 2 points are very important in showing his character that take us through the entire book of Job. Now, his riches are great, but his riches are a result of God blessing him because of his character. Now, you see something interesting, of course, here. Excuse me. You see the only conversation between Satan and God, which is very interesting because you don't see this anywhere else in the Bible. Excuse me for a second. And you see Job presenting himself before the Lord, which you don't see elsewhere in the Bible as well. Job comes in because he has to give an account of his activities, as well as the angels who give an account to God. And so he's among them. And God asked him, where are you coming from? He says, from roaming to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. That's exactly what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. He says, the devil, Satan, walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So he's always traversing the earth, trying to kill, steal, and destroy, as it says in John 10:10. So that's always been his MO. And then God brings up Job. Have you considered my servant Job? He's sticking it to Satan because he knows that Satan would like to get to Job, but he cannot. That's because of Job being with God, he's untouchable to Satan in that sense. Because he fears God, there is a hedge about him, a protection about him, where Satan cannot claim his soul and influence him like he does others. And so this begins the controversial issue. God is not betting with Satan. God is not taking a wager with Satan, as many people see it as it appears. Satan has his purpose. Satan's purpose is that if you take away everything a person has, they will curse God to their face. No human really serves God purely. We only serve God based upon what God does for us. And if God would take all of that away, there is no pure love. There is no pure faith. There is no pure devotion to God. That's Satan's position. So we can infer from that God's position is, you're wrong. There is a faith. There is a devotion. There is a pureness that even when everything else is stripped away, will stand the test. And that's what we have in the book of Job. It is God proving that there is a faithfulness that is stronger than all of the temptation, all of the suffering, and all of the sorrow that can come upon a human individual. So it's not just dealing with human suffering, it's dealing with the integrity to trust God in human suffering. You know, we have the problem of theodicy. That is, the atheistic argument is that if there's a good God, why is there evil in the world? It's either because God will not remove it, in which case he's not all good, or he cannot remove it, in which case he's not all powerful. And this is the only real atheistic argument. Well, if God, of course, has a third option. He is able and he is willing. It's just that God is not willing that any should perish. So God endures evil to redeem people from it and then destroys it later, as opposed to get rid of evil immediately. If he did, nobody would be here around to redeem because we're all touched with evil. And so Job deals with that issue. So that sets up the confrontation. Of course, Job has everything taken away in a series of calamities that cannot be coincidental. And of course, that's what we see happening in chapter 1. And yet in Job's grief, he falls down before the Lord and worships him and says, naked came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So even in grief and mourning and sorrow, he is still worshiping and praising God and not sinning with his lips. Now, mind you, Job has no idea that the whole thing from Satan's point is to drive him to curse God with his lips. And yet Job does not curse God with his lips. So he lost round 1. And so in chapter 2, God brings that back up to Satan when he appears again. And Satan comes up with his second plan. Yea, skin for skin, all that a man has will he give for his own life. But if you touch his flesh and his bones, he will curse you. So now he has to change his plan. Everything he had was taken away, but he still had himself. He was not touched. And Satan's position is, if a person is under enough misery, and if they have to lose their selves, they're willing to forsake everything to protect that. And so now God gives Satan the permission to take away Job's health, but he has to spare his life. So self-preservation and the love of God, which is stronger? That's really the question here. And so Satan now takes away Job's health and he makes him suffer miserably while he's grieving. And that takes us into the rest of the book of Job. He is suffering miserably in his flesh. Even his wife gets to the point where she can't take it. She says, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. In chapter 2, verse 9. And Job says, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. What, shall we even not receive good at the hand of the Lord and not adversity? And all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So not even knowing that Satan is trying to get him to sin with his lips, because Job has always lived faithfully to the Lord from the inside, God has built a reserve in him not to fail and curse God with his lips. And so Job retained his suffering, and it was prolonged agony. After a certain amount of time, his friends came to visit him, and they saw that Job was so distorted through his physical pain that they could not even recognize him. And they all lifted up their voices and wept. And they cried, and they sat down with Job for 7 days and 7 nights and didn't utter a word, because they saw how great his grief was. And after 7 days, Job could not take it any longer. And he opens his mouth, but he doesn't curse the Lord. He curses his own day. Cursed is the day wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man child conceived. And so he goes through a series of miseries where he wishes he was never born, or he wishes he was a stillbirth, which came out of the womb and just died. As he says later, I should have been carried from birth to the grave. He wishes that his life had never existed. It would have been better not for him to have to enjoy all of the great joys of his children, or of his wealth, or of his prosperity, or of his influence, than to go through the misery that he's going through. He wants desperately to die. That's what you see in verses 20 of chapter 3 on through the end. And yet he will not do the one thing that will assure his death. He will not curse God. Why doesn't he take this option when he has expressed that he desperately wants to die? Look at verse 21 of chapter 3. They desperately look for it as for hidden treasures. They want to die, and yet he does not curse God in order to do it. But at the end of that diatribe, or that monologue, I should say, of Job, in chapter 3, he says, the thing that I feared most has come upon me. And when he starts to utter that he was not in safety, neither was he quiet, neither had he rest, yet trouble came. This is what his friends picked up on. And so his friends who were there silent, comforting him, now have a change of heart. They begin to come against Job because they're convinced Job has a secret that he's been keeping from God and from them. And this is where God is allowing him to suffer, because he has hidden sin in his life that he needs to confess. And it's their job to beat it out of him, to bring it out of him. And so now the contest gets worse. Instead of his friends comforting him, they are coming against him, because they are convinced God would never allow a person to suffer like Job unless Job did something wrong. So Job needs to confess and turn to God, and that will cause God to return and heal Job. And all of the conversation goes in that way. So the book of Job is based upon dialogues with his 3 friends. And he has 3 dialogues back and forth with each one of them, except one, where he has 2 dialogues back and forth. And no matter what Job says, they continue to fight against him. And this continues on all the way until you get up to chapter 32. And then you find out there's another person who's been there all the time, but you didn't know he was there. His name was Elihu. And Elihu doesn't say anything. He waits for the older ones to speak. But after a while, he has to speak and talk. He has to utter what's in his heart. And from that point, he comes and he talks to Job. He wants to justify Job, but he comes in a way where he's feeling as though Job is self-righteous, which is what the friends believed as well. He just takes a slightly different approach. And so that leads us up to chapter 38, when eventually God comes out of the whirlwind and addresses Job, and he spanks him thoroughly. Who is this that brings forth these words without knowledge? And so that takes us to the end of Job in chapter 42, where God eventually returns Job's life to himself and blesses him with everything he lost. He gets it back. He gets 10 more children, and his daughters are the most beautiful in the land. He gets all of his livestock back, and he gets his health back, and he gets his reputation and honor and back. All of the things that he had lost that you think are lost forever, God returns them to him. So this is the process that goes on. And in the process, Job has some questions and some difficulties. So I'm just going to illuminate a little bit of that, and then our 30 minutes will be up, and we can go into the second phase. Job is having his complaint before God, and he gets to the point where he has to vent. He has to say it and express it. And his friends are taking it to use against him. Eliphaz comes out first and says that he had some vision where God says, "Shall mortal man be more just than God?" And that type of thing. Bildad comes out and he basically says, well, God may have taken away your children because they sinned. You just need to get over it, Job, and come back to God, and maybe he'll bless you. I mean, some cruel things. And Zophar, the Naamathite, in chapter 11 says, I want you to know that your iniquity deserves more than what God is putting on you. You're worse than that. God is being merciful to you. I mean, they come at him hard, and that type of thing. And no matter what Job does, it doesn't move them from that position. He says, you are physicians of no value. You should comfort your friend, but rather you're coming against me. He says, I'm not asking anything from you. But Job says, I'm going to complain in the bitterness of my soul. I'm going to speak. So just, if you don't have anything to say, don't say anything. You can leave if you want, but I'm going to speak. And so the more Job continued to maintain his integrity, the more they felt as though Job has no right to retain his integrity because he has sinned. And that's the exact thing Satan wants to bring about on Job. To break his integrity is the same as to curse God. And Job will not do it. So in this process, Job is hurt. His feelings are hurt. His friends are talking down to him. He says, I'm not inferior to you. He says, what you know, I know. You know, you can't talk down to me, in chapter 12, verse 3. And he repeats it in chapter 13, verse 2. He said, and they would have never done this to Job if Job was still had everything. Excuse me. Now, the main thing you have to understand is Job's character never changed. The only thing that changed was his circumstances. And his circumstances caused his friends to look at him differently. But his character retained itself. And after a while, Job started fighting back. You are not going to take away my integrity. And in Job's depression, he wanted God to kill him in chapter 6. He wanted God to take him out. He still said that though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He would bring forth these statements of faith out of that dark hole that he was in, which is an incredible thing. Where are they coming from? And he showed a tremendous knowledge, even in the gospel, before the gospel was there. He says, though, yet I will trust him, though he slay me. He says, if a man die, will he live again? All the appointed days will I wait till my change comes. He's referring to the resurrection. How does he know about that if he's living in the days of Genesis? He also talks about the fact that even after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God. He knows he's going to have a resurrected body, and he's going to see the Lord at the latter days upon the earth in chapter 19. How does he know that? He says, my record is in heaven and my witness is on high in chapter 16. In other words, he says, my record in eternity is in God's hands. I don't trust anything else. And he says, after I'm tried, I shall come forth as gold. Chapter 23, verse 10. So in his depression, in his misery, and in all of these things that are coming upon him, he still has these faith statements that come from deep down in his soul, and they start spreading out like lava out of a volcano. And this is an incredible thing that God is demonstrating. This man's knowledge of God and this man's faithfulness to God and this man's crying out to God is stronger than all of his misery and depression and his pain, while the two are going on concurrently. And this is what's so amazing about the book of Job. So I'm just going to stop here. That's just a basic overview.
Wow, wow, wow. That's great. I really love the bringing out those faith nuggets that Job had. I mean, way back before the New Testament, you know.
That's right.
Before even if we look at the history as the way you put it, to the reason why people believe that the book of Job was much even earlier than Genesis is, then you begin to be amazed. This is long before God was coming to man, coming to Abraham and saying, you know, I will make a nation out of you. So this is quite an interesting thing. So yes. I would like us to start with the first question, and the first question comes from the council. I don't know whether it was a heavenly council where God was there and the sons of God appeared and Job also appeared. Now the question is, was that in heaven or where was that council taking place? And the second thing is, why is it that Satan could just appear before the Almighty God? If that is heaven, does it mean that Satan's got the right and the freedom to just appear before God at will? So, and then as you deal with this question, we will then later on look at the sons of God that also appeared in this council meeting in Genesis, and also in Job, and then the sons of God that we also came across in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 following, and also where they gave birth to giants. And that was also something we need to understand and unpack. So I'm sure it's a mouthful of questions, but I'm sure you get the interrelationship of the question.
Sure. Those are great questions, by the way. And so I'm going to start with Satan being in heaven. Apparently what you find in Job is that Satan has already been kicked out of heaven, which is why he's become Satan. Satan is the devil, and he was once an angel that resided with the other angels in heaven. But now when he tried to lift himself up, he was thrust out of heaven. But he still has access to heaven in the sense that he has to give an account of himself before God, as do the angels. So everything has to account to God. He's not there because he burst in and God can't stop him. He's there because he has to account to God just like everyone else. And though he's evil, everything has to account to God's providential control, including Satan. You notice what God said to him, where are you coming from? You know, and that is he's reporting what he's doing. And so Satan has that, he's on the realm of the earth, but he has to report back to heaven. Now he's going to lose that access even to heaven. It hasn't happened yet, but it's recorded in Revelation chapter 12, where there is war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. And of course, Michael the archangel defeated Satan, and he was cast out of heaven, and he was cast into the earth. And he knows that he has but a short time. He knows that that access to heaven is gone forever. Now, when I say access to heaven, it doesn't mean that he has the privileges of heaven. It means he has to go back and report. I believe the scene did take place in heaven. And the sons of God here are obviously referring to the angels, those who've been created by God, who are giving a report, and Satan is among them when he's giving a report in heaven. So he's been cast out. He doesn't have the glories, but he still has to account to God as to his activities. So he can't do anything without God's permission. This is why he couldn't get to Job. He couldn't get to Job. He has to beg God's permission to get to Job. He says, have you not fenced him on every side and put a hedge around about him? Who wouldn't serve you? But if you take away everything he has, he will curse you to your face. It appears as though God is saying, okay, I'm going to bet you, devil, and I'll tell you what, we'll see who wins. That's the way it appears, but that's not really. Satan has his purposes, and his purposes is to try to hurt God. And that's why he said they will curse you to your face, because he knows that God loves humanity. And for them to curse him would hurt him. And Satan is trying to hurt God. However, God has his purposes and why it looks like he's playing along. God is actually initiating the conversation because he wants to put Job on display. And it's in his wisdom and his divine purposes to put Job on display for this. Now I'm going to go to the question you mentioned about the sons of God in Job, as opposed to the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 and the Nephilim that follow these angels. There are two views in Genesis chapter 6. And one of those views is that the fallen angels, which are the devils, saw the daughters of men, human women, that they were beautiful, and they had sex with them. And the sex that they had with them created this hybrid race of giants. It says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. And so that was responsible for the corruption of the earth that eventually led to God destroying the earth through the flood. That's one theory, because the sons of God in Job were the angels. Therefore, they make the assumption that the sons of God in Genesis are the angels as well, but they would be fallen angels. You see, in Job, when he says when the sons of God came together, it's used of angels that are not fallen. But in Genesis chapter 6, if you take the interpretation, these are angels, it would have to be fallen angels or demons. And so that's one view. There's another view of where the sons of God came from, and that's the view I think is correct. I think the sons of God in Genesis is referring not to fallen angels that had sex with human women, but I think it's referring to the sons of God who were of the righteous line of Abel, the son of Adam and Eve, whom Cain killed in Genesis chapter 4. If you watch it very carefully, Abel was the righteous child because he was the one who offered the correct sacrifice to God. But Abel was killed by his brother Cain, who was envious and jealous of him. And then later, Adam and Eve had another son. If you look in Genesis chapter 4, verses 24 through 26, you'll see that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare another son, and his name was Seth. Seth means appointed instead of. So Seth took the place of Abel. And then Seth had a son by the name of Enos. And it says, then men began to call themselves by the name of the Lord. That's the way the Hebrew reads. In other words, Seth reestablished the lineage of those who were serving God correctly. And it was Seth's line that you see in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5. Seth had Enos. Enos had Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared. And then Jared had Enoch, and Enoch had Methuselah. Methuselah had Lamech, and Lamech had Noah. And Noah was the last righteous one before the flood. So the reason I think that the sons of God is referring to that here is because when God is about to destroy the earth, notice what he says. And we're going to look at Genesis chapter 6 very carefully. In verse 3, he says, my spirit shall not always strive with man. He doesn't make any mention of demons. My spirit will not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. That is, they had 120 years to repent before God would bring the flood. Now let's get to the giants in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6. The Nephilim. There were giants in the earth in those days. And so there were incredible giants in the earth in those days. But that doesn't necessarily mean that demons intermixing with human women created giants, because in the Old Testament, you will also see races of giants that came later. There were races of giants with Goliath. In fact, Goliath's sons were all giants. When David had to take him out, and his men, mighty men, took out the rest of Goliath's group. You also see the Anakim in the land of promise. When the children of Israel were to go into the promised land, they were afraid because they saw the sons of Anak. Anak, the Anakims, were a race of giants. You also see Rabbath and other races in the book of Judges. So giants existed after the flood in many areas. In fact, the bedstead of one was 11 feet long. You had incredible giants. So that tends to show me that because you had giants in the earth in those days didn't mean it had to be by demonic interaction. Now, there's still a possibility, but it's less in my mind. And then another thing that I see is that in order for demons to have sexual relations with women, of course, we know that angels can take human form. So that's not a problem. But you have to also believe that demons can take human DNA, because you would have to have sperm in order to impregnate women. And according to Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, when Jesus talks about living in heaven, he says, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven, which tends to deal with the fact that angels do not procreate. If that's the case and demons are fallen angels, then it's very likely that they don't have the ability to procreate. And so putting all of this together, plus in Genesis chapter 6, when you look at verses 11 and 12, you'll see that there was violence in the earth in those days. And God saw that all human beings were full of violence. And so he charges flesh for the problem. It says in verse 5 of Genesis chapter 6, God saw that every imagination of the man's heart was evil continually. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Now, no doubt there was a demonic influence. And I'm sure that many people were possessed by demons in those days. But God puts all of the blame on human flesh and carnality. And in that sense, what I think was the sons of God, that righteous remnant that continued to live and preach the word of God, over time, their children and grandchildren began to turn away from God and apostatize. And it happened at such a fast rate that by the time of Noah, all of them had turned away from God except one, and that was Noah. And during the day of the flood, all of the righteous line before Noah had just died, including Methuselah. Methuselah died the year of the flood, and he was the last one of that lineage remaining. So God waited all the way down until there was one righteous man, and then he used him to repopulate the earth, his sons. And so that's why I tend to take the second interpretation, that the sons of God in Genesis is referring to a different group than the sons of God in Job. However, that other interpretation is very popular, which is why this comes up, because they make the insinuation that because sons of God usually in the Old Testament is translated as angels, that must be what it is in Genesis 6. But it would have to be translated under fallen angels, and everything else would follow in Genesis 6, whereas where he's using sons of God as angels in the rest of the Old Testament, he's talking about holy angels that did not fall.
So thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful time, Dr. Ledbetter. We are really appreciative of you and your time. And we want to say, give our love and our regard to the church, to your wife, and to the church. And yes, what else can I say? Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you to all of you all there in Namibia and those that may even be from Zambia or other countries. We are so glad and privileged to be part of the team. So anything I can do to help, I'm more than willing to do. Thank you so much. It's a privilege and honor to be with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Okay.
God
Thank
bless.
you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the Sunday.